So Shavua Tov, everyone. We're starting this week. We're coming out of Parashat Noach, which teaches us about the Mabul and in general the Teivat Noach, which again the parasha starts off with the world being wiped out, and then only one person and his family, Noah and his family, were kept alive, kept. To an extent, they were kept in a prison. On the one hand, they were kept in their own ark. On the other hand, it was almost as if Chazal teach us that it's almost like a prison that they were kept in. And the end of the parasha, they leave the ark and they start living in the real world again. And then finally, the parasha ends with Abraham being born. So when looking at this parasha, when Chachamim, when our sages look at this parasha and they try to learn from it, it almost seems like we're criticizing Noah when looking at him. And on the one hand, people say that he was a righteous person. On the other hand, there's something about him that we people, the Jews that are reading the parasha, do not connect to him as much. When wanting to consider who was the first Jew was Abraham. He's our father. Noah is not considered the first Jew. He's something in the middle between Adam and Abraham. There's Noah, and really, if we look at the Noam Elimelech for this parasha, the Rabbi Elimelech from Lizhensk, he writes that it says Eile Toldot Noach, that these are the things that come out, the Toladot. We know that in Shabbat we have Avot, which is like the father, like the main archetype, let's call it, of a figure of a person. For when we look at our fathers, as we said, we look at Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the father, and there's Toladot, is what comes out of it. And Noah is not considered a father. And the Noam Elimelech says why? It says because right afterwards it says Noach ish tzaddik tamim haya b'dorotav. Noah was a righteous and whole person. He had no problems. Everything was good on his side. And we know that the main criticism about him was that he didn't care. Well, he cared. When people came and asked him, "What are you doing?" He said, "You guys are not behaving right. We're building this ark to get out because the world is going to be destroyed." So he wanted people to do tshuva, but he didn't go out of his comfort zone. We know that the basic translation of the word Noach in Hebrew is comfort. He was in his comfort zone. He was in his own ark. He was in his own place. We know that the famous comparison, when we compare Abraham to Noah, we say that Abraham said, that God said to Abraham, "Go in front of me, italech lefanai." And when we talk about Noach, it says, "Eta Elokim italech Noach." Noach walked besides Hashem. He walked besides God, next to God, versus in front. Meaning he was doing what he was told. He was in his comfort zone. And that, by default, that could lead to failure. As we see at the end of the parasha, Noah did fail by the fact that he drank too much and was drunk, and then his son did some inappropriate thing and he cursed him. Lots of things, non-favorable things that happened to him at the end. And this is all part of Noah being who he was, which is just following the law. Now, this week we want to go back to the wonders. Here we have the wonders of the week that speaks about Parashat Noach. We're actually starting the year. We're in the second Parasha. We're starting this year. And this year, we're going to speak from, Rav Ginsburg is going to explain things from a famous book. It's called Kol Simcha, The Voice of Happiness. That's the simple translation. It's brought from Reb Simcha Bunim from Pshisra. He passed away about 270 years ago, roughly. He was in the third, fourth, fifth generation of Chassidut. We know today that Chassidim that came out of him is Chassidut Gur. We know that Kotsk, which is famous, there's no today Kotsk, but Kotsk is the beginning of many Chassiduyot. There's Sadigura. So many came out of Reb Simcha Bunim from Shisra. I think the Reginer, said about him that his name is Simcha, his name is happiness, and he will bring happiness to the world. So this year, every week, Rav Ginsburg is going to bring something from Reb Simcha Bunim from Peshischa, and we're going to expand on it. So this week, Rav Ginsburg brought a whole explanation about how to learn, how we see, how does Peshischa's thought process work, and what we can learn from it. So that's what this week's we're going to talk about. That's what this week's wonder is about. So first, we'll start from the first pasuk. So what do we said in the beginning? Bereshit bara Elokim. In the beginning, God created. So Reb Simcha Bunim says, if you want to take these words and compare them to something, you can compare it to the pasuk Leoseh hashamayim betvuna, that God created the heaven with a tremendous wisdom. What is this wisdom? What do we learn from the heaven? And the answer, Reb Simcha Bunim answers, is like we said in Shema Yisrael. Shema is Su marom einechem. Raise your eyes to the heaven. That means that we can learn about Hashem, we can learn about God from looking at this world. More deeply, what Reb Simcha Bunim is explaining is that if you want to learn, why did God create the world? Why was this world created? The world was created so that we can learn about Hashem. We can learn about Hashem by looking at this world. So, again, if you connect the pasuk Bereshit bara Elokim, in the beginning God created. What did He create? So He created a way for us to see Him, for us to recognize Hashem by looking at this world. Second. Now, we know that the Maggid from Mezrich, the second generation of Chassidut, would say that he can look at a watch and recognize things about the watchman who created the watch. Meaning, when looking at something, many times people say that when you see food, like you say, I can see that the cook is a certain type of person, whether he's a happy person, etc., where he puts a lot of spices, etc. Same thing about you can see by a builder. A builder that builds in one design says something about him, another design, etc. So when looking at something, when you're looking at a watch in this example, a dish in the cook's example, or the world in Hashem's example, when looking at the world, you can see Hashem. So if we want to see Hashem, if we want to learn about Hashem, we learn from this world. So again, why in the beginning the world was created? What was it created for? It was created for us to recognize Hashem. So again, what you learn from this, what you can see from this is that in Peshischa, they had a way of learning Pshat, of learning the simple letters of Torah, and understanding something in Chassidut from them. And you can say it in one statement, that God created the world in order for us to know Him, but there's a lot to learn from that and a lot to gain from that. There's another pasuk that he brings over there. He says, "Nodaba she'arim ba'ala." That in the Song of Songs, Solomon said that the husband is known in the gates. And what we learn from it is that every person has its own gate. Sha'ar could be a gate, but it could also be an assessment. If you want to assess Hashem's world, you can look at your gate to the world, your gate of assessment, and by this you can see Hashem's world. Now this is very interesting because it teaches us a couple things. Number one, it teaches us that every person has its own gate. If you want to learn something well, you can learn it by observing the world from your perspective, just like every person has its own. One second. Sorry. Just like every person has its too many technical things, I get distracted. What's the negative side of working with Zoom and not in person with a book? What we're trying to explain from Peshischa is that just like every person has a way of looking at things, his way in life, his nachala, his place in the world, in the land of Israel. Every Jew has a certain spot in the land of Israel. Same thing, every Jew has a gate that he sees the world from that gate. He can assess the world and assess Hashem from that gate. So the first thing we see is that it's very personal. That the Torah, if you learn Torah, especially in the way of Peshischa, but in the way that we're trying to learn, it's very personal. So that's the first thing we see. The second thing we see is that everyone can do it. Meaning, if you say that it's something that only wise people can get, so only certain people that get it can connect to it. But if you say that every person has its own gate, his own gate of looking, so every person can look at Torah from his way and have everything open in front of him. He has his own way, which is fitting exactly for him. So again, what do we do for that? We have to look at the world and recognize Hashem from the world. The famous pasuk, Shema Israel, listen, O Israel, but in a simple fact, listen. How do you listen? When you look at the world, when you lift up your eyes and look at the world and try to find Hashem in the world. If you do it in your way, each and every person has his own way in looking at the world and gaining knowledge of Hashem from that. Now, again, what we're trying to do, I'm explaining again that this is Reb Ginsburg looking at statements or perushim from Reb Simcha Bunim from Peshischa and about Torah and explaining them a little bit. So the next thing he's explaining is Rashi, the famous Rashi that has the question, the first question in Torah from Rashi is, why does the Torah start from Bereshit, from the story? If Torah is meant for us to know what to do in life, to know mitzvot, to know what to do, then if it's a book of laws, then tell me the first law. What's the first law? That you should have a month and years and timing, a chodesh of this month. What do we do? What do we do? You do 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, if it's a book of law, then start from the law. Why does it start from the story, from Bereshit, from the beginning? And the answer is, and this is a very strong answer, that if you don't know Hashem, there's no point of doing the laws. When you're doing something, when you're trying to teach a child, when we're trying to educate, to have chinuch, real education, real chinuch is telling the child, explaining to the child that there is Hashem and who is Hashem, and because there is Hashem, we're doing a mitzvot. Just to do it like a parrot, like a monkey that does what he's told. Today, it's very easy to explain. You say like a factory. We're not looking for people, for Jews, for people in general, to be doing things in a manufacturing line, just doing what they're told. We're looking for people to really recognize Hashem, as we said, by its own gate, and from that, do what you're told. So if you're looking for that, first you got to start from the beginning. You can't start from the first laws. You got to start from the beginning. So that's the explanation of Rashi. Now, another very interesting thing that we can learn from Peshischa is that at the end of creation, what is the last pasuk in creation? Hasher bara Elokim, that God has created, la'asot, to do. And the translation is either to fix or in order to lekayem. Lekayem is more to survive. Survive in the bigger picture, to you can call it to be alive. So God created the world for two things: to fix. He created a world that's broken that we need to fix, and in order to survive, to live, to create in that sense. And what we learn from that, and this is a very important thing to learn, is that if you want to survive, if you want to live well, if you want to be alive, you have to do things. You have to fix. You have to work. The more you work, the more you do, the more you survive, the more you live. Again, sometimes the translation is not 100%. Surviving sounds like something that's not something that's not as pleasurable. But the simple translation of kiyum is to exist. Meaning, I have a friend who's a physician, or not exactly. He deals with a lot of people that are getting old and need that have health issues. Everyone should be healthy, Bezrat Hashem, especially our Rav, Rabbi Yitzchak Feibish ben Breina Malka, and all the other people that need to be healthy. And he said the number one thing that makes people unhealthy is pension, is leaving work, is not doing. When a person is doing, he's going to keep his health relatively well. Obviously, there's other things, but one of the main factors that he said in order to live well is to do something. And this we learn from the creation, that God created this world in order to fix, to do. And if you want to be existent, if you want to live in this world, you got to do something. You got to fix. So that's another beautiful thing that we learn from Peshischa. Now, another thing that he explains based on the pasuk that Vayhi Adam lenefesh chaya, that a person becomes a soul, a living soul. What does he explain? That a living soul, the famous translation, is a ruach mimalela, a speaking wind. But in simple sense, that a person, what is the difference between a person and all the other things in creation? That a person can talk. Now, many times a person has a hard time talking, whether it's a child that needs to learn to speak, and all the way until a grown-up that wants to influence people and wants to speak to people. He says that the way to be able to speak is you have to speak with your soul. And what does your soul connect to? Your desire, your wants. If you have the right desire, the right drive, let's call it, for life, then you'll be able to talk about it. And if you want to have the easy way of talking, you got to be well connected to your desire, to your ratzon. The more you're connected to that, the more you're able to do. Now we know that the Baal Shem Tov was an expert on giving people the drive, the will, wanting, connection. Even when you do it even when you connect through, even if it's not good things, we know that very famously that one of the ways to stop crime is to have sports, is to have people play basketball. Why is that? Because when you're connecting to something, when you want something, even if it's something that's not good, that does not come from the good side necessarily, but when you have a desire for something, then you're going to have an easier time to speak, to be a person, to be a soul, to be a good person that's connected. In order for that, you have to speak. And to speak, you have to have the right will. So again, he's learning this, the Simcha Bunim is learning this from the pasuk that explains that man becomes nefesh chaya, a living soul, by learning to speak. And how does he do that? By having will, by having inspiration. Then he goes on to explain the Midrash. Again, we're explaining various different words from Reb Simcha Bunim from Peshischa and learning from them. The Midrash says very interestingly about the end of days, that at the end of days, all the nations will come to Hashem and say, things didn't work out as planned. But if we would have had mitzvot, if we would have had Torah, we would have been better than the Jews even. So Hashem listens to it and says, okay, let's try it out. He says, go build a sukkah. Go build a hat next to your house, put some leaves on it, and live in the sukkah. Do a mitzvah. Let's see you guys. And all the goyim says, no problem. They go and they build a sukkah. They live outside their house. And then Hashem goes and takes the sun out of its packaging. It's nautik. It's like surrounding packaging things that keeps it from heating too much the world. Very spiritual thing, but very interesting. And it becomes very hot in the world. And when it's hot, people want to go back to their air conditioning. So they leave the sukkah, and they say that the goyim, that the non-Jews that accepted this mitzvah now kick the sukkah. They give it a kick and they leave. And Hashem says, you see, it's not the circumstances. So the Gemara, the Midrash right away asks, what do you mean? But we as Jews don't also have to sit in the sukkah if it's too hot. That's fine. It says, you're right, but Jews, when it's too hot, they take down their head a little bit. They leave they say they're sorry and they leave. But the non-Jews, they kick. And that's the Midrash. Now, the explanation from Peshischa is that every Jew has a connection to Hashem, has the desire and the connection to want to be close to Hashem, to do mitzvot, to do Torah. We all have the connection. And when we have mitzvot, it's having that connection, have the ability to be out there, to be alive. Now, when you do a mitzvah, it's like wearing, it's like a piece of clothing. It's like a package that you take the things that you have inside and you package it to Hashem by doing a certain mitzvah, for example, sitting in the sukkah. But what happens when a person has to take off its clothing, for example, when it's too hot? Then you see if he's connected or not. If you're connected, then you're working with your head. You're able to say, okay, now is not a good time. I put down my head and I say sorry and I leave. But when you're not connected, when you're working with your instinct, with your feet, then if it doesn't work out, you kick it. It's a beautiful thing, I think, that we can learn for life. That what is the difference between a wise person, a smart person, the way he behaves in life, and a person that works based on his instinct and not necessarily with his brain, is that when trouble happens, do you kick or do you work with your head and bow down your head and say you're sorry? If you kick, then you're not connected to this. Then this is not you. Then it's not going to work. It's not going to last. If you're able to take things as they come and say that you don't understand, put down your head a little bit and move forward, then it's something that you're connected to. So this is another thing that we learned from Peshischa. Okay, let's a bunch of other things that that Rabbi Ginsburg speaks about in the second section. Mainly about Noah and his prayer. Meaning, and I'll say this in a short version, that sometimes, like the explanation that we have in the story from Parasha, that when a person is really in bad shape, when he's beat up, when a person in the, let's say chas v'shalom, if a person doesn't have a hand, and he's going and asking for charity, he doesn't need to explain why he's asking. By him being there and not having chas v'shalom, not having a hand, then you understand that he's in a bad situation. Same thing, we conceptually, when a Jew is having trouble, just by default, that he's a person and he's going through things, for example, by Noah being in the ark all by himself, that by default is like prayer. And there's something very comforting that we can learn from it and take from it, that simply when something is not going well, when we're suffering, the simple fact that we are suffering is already a prayer. Now, after we understand this and connect to it, then we can connect words to it and say to Hashem and ask to be uplifted and to get out of trouble. But the first thing to understand is that we are in trouble. By default, it's like prayer. It's like when King David says, "Va'ani tefillah," me, myself, I am prayer. Why am I prayer? Because when I'm going through things and Hashem sees it, and again, I'm doing it with my head, I'm not kicking, I'm saying to Hashem that I'm sorry for the situation, but I'm in a bad spot, right away, that by default, by itself, is already a prayer. And then afterwards, when you're able to understand that and connect to it and then speak it out loud, it becomes a real prayer. And from that, you can be saved. That's another beautiful thing that we can learn and that we can connect to and also can comfort us in certain times, that by default, Hashem sees us in the situation that we're in, and that by default becomes prayer. Okay, I think that's the stuff that we wanted to cover. There's obviously a lot more to cover from both this week's wonders and in general learning this special things from Parasha. If there's any questions, I'll try to answer. If not, we'll talk more next week with Hashem. So I have the chat open, or you can open the microphones, I think. Okay, so if there's no questions, everyone should have a Shavua Tov. We know that in Chassidut, the troubles of Noah being in an ark and when the world is filled with waves is the trouble that people have with their finances. That's the Alter Rebbe speaks about that, and it's very comforting to know that you can be close with Hashem in the troubles, like we spoke, that by default you can be prayer in every trouble. And Bezrat Hashem, everyone should be very healthy and wealthy to be able to help other people and help bring the whole boat, the whole world to redemption. So Shavua Tov, everyone.